I grew up around farms, but I never worked on one full-time until I was in my early 20s. I took a job helping an older guy who owned a big property outside a small town. The farm was quiet most of the year, mostly cattle and some hay fields, nothing too special. I thought it would be easy money, peaceful work, and a simple life for a while. I didn't expect anything dangerous or strange, but the thing that happened out there stayed with me in a way I still can't shake. It started during a stretch of late summer heat when the air felt heavy and the dust stuck to my skin the second I stepped outside. Most of my days were spent checking fences, rolling bales, and keeping water troughs full. The farm sat in a low valley, and there were spots on the property where sound didn't carry right, places where everything felt a little too still. At first I didn't notice it much, but over time I started to feel something off in the far back pasture. It was the roughest part of the land, with tall grass, wind-bent trees, and shallow dry creek beds snaking through it. That was where the cattle liked to wander because the grass grew thicker back there. It was also where the boss kept telling me to keep an eye out for strays, either wild dogs or coyotes, because he'd lost 2 calves the previous month. I didn't think much about it until one afternoon when I went out alone to check a section of broken fence. The heat was pushing down hard, and all I could hear was my boots in the dry grass and the buzzing of insects. The air smelled like dust and old weeds. I had to walk a good distance because the truck couldn't get through without sinking into soft patches of dirt. So I parked near a windmill and walked the rest of the way with wire, pliers, and staples hanging from my belt. As I reached the broken section of fence, I saw that something had pushed through from the outside. The posts were bent in, not out, and the bottom wire was torn from the staple marks like something heavy had shoved itself underneath. The dirt near the gap was disturbed, but not in a normal way. There were no clear paw prints, no hoof marks, nothing that told me what caused it. Just a wide, smooth drag through the dust like something had slid on its belly. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I fixed the fence and moved on, but I kept thinking about it the rest of the day. A few hours later, when the sun started dropping behind the far hills, I went to check on the herd. They usually stayed close together near the water, but that evening they were packed tighter than usual. They all stood facing the same direction, bodies stiff, ears pointed toward the tree line near the back creek bed. They didn't run or make noise, just stared. I followed their attention and saw nothing but dark brush and long shadows stretching across the grass. It made my stomach tighten for no real reason. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing those cattle standing like statues, all staring at the same thing. I told myself it was probably a coyote or a feral dog. But the next morning when I went back out, I found something else that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Down near the creek bed, there were fresh marks in the dirt where something had moved through again. Not prints, just these long, dragging trails that curved strangely, like something heavy but narrow had passed through in a hurry. It didn't look like any animal I'd seen before. I kept working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from that tree line. I knew it sounded stupid even inside my own head, but it felt too quiet in that part of the pasture. Even the birds didn't seem to fly over it. 2 days later, it got worse. I had gone out earlier than usual because I wanted to finish before the sun got too high. There was a thick fog sitting low over the ground, and it made the whole farm look washed out and muted. I parked the truck by the creek crossing and walked toward the far slope where the cattle had been grazing. As I crossed the small dry bed, I saw something up ahead on the opposite bank. At first I thought it was one of the calves lying down, but the shape wasn't right. The shoulders looked too narrow, the back too long, and the head wasn't facing the way I expected. It wasn't lying flat. It was raised slightly, like it was looking at me even though the fog blurred most of the details. I took a few steps closer, and something inside me froze. My brain knew immediately something wasn't right with what I was seeing. There was this weird sense of wrongness, like the uncanny valley feeling people talk about, where something looks almost normal but just off enough to make your skin crawl. The thing had a long body, too long for a dog and too low for a calf. Its tail was thick and stretched out behind it, heavier than anything I'd seen on a farm animal. The way it sat there didn't match any animal posture I recognized. It didn't have proper hocks either. Its back legs looked strange, like straight rods instead of jointed limbs. The fog started to thin around it, and I could see its chest rising and falling slowly. It was alive. That realization hit me hard and sent a shot of fear through me. My whole body went tight. I wanted to get back to the truck, but I couldn't seem to move. I was stuck between staring at it and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind kept trying to match it to something familiar. A dog, a calf, a coyote, anything, but nothing fit. And the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. I could feel my pulse thumping hard in my neck. I was about 20 feet away, close enough that I could hear faint breathing from it. Slow, deep, almost measured breaths. It never jerked or twitched the way injured animals usually do. It just watched me, its head slightly tilted, its body still as a stone except for the rise and fall of its chest. I noticed the dirt around it was disturbed in the same smooth, dragged pattern I'd seen near the fence. That was the moment everything inside me screamed to get back to the truck. I forced myself to step backward without turning my back. My legs felt stiff, like they didn't want to respond. Every inch of movement felt like it took too long, like the air had gotten heavier around me. The thing didn't move as I backed up. It didn't even shift, but its eyes followed me the whole time. I kept retreating until my boots hit the dry creek bed again, and only then did I turn around and walk fast. Too fast to be casual, but not fast enough to look panicked. Back to the truck. The second I reached the door, I yanked it open, got inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit for a minute before I could start the engine. I kept expecting to see the thing coming down the bank toward me, but when I finally worked up the nerve to look, it was still in the same spot, still watching. I left the pasture and didn't go back the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the shape of its body, the long, heavy tail, the strange legs, the dragging marks in the dirt. Every logical explanation I came up with fell apart when I matched it to what I actually saw. It wasn't a calf. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a dog. And it moved in a way I had never seen before. The next morning, I went back out with the boss, both of us riding separate. I didn't want to stand in that spot alone again. When we reached the creek bed, the thing was gone. The only sign that anything had been there were the same long dragged tracks leading into the brush. We followed them a bit, but they disappeared into the trees where the ground got hard and covered with leaves. We never found out what it was. Over the next few weeks, the cattle kept avoiding that area. They wouldn't graze near the creek bed anymore. They stayed close to the front fields where the grass was thinner but the sightlines were wide and open. And I didn't blame them. I stayed on the farm for another month before leaving for another job. I told myself the whole time that maybe it was a deformed animal, maybe some strange hybrid that nature didn't shape right, something rare and unlucky. It helped me sleep at night, but I never believed it fully. The memory of it still sits in my mind like a heavy stone, something real and unsettling that doesn't fit anywhere. What scares me the most isn't what I saw that day, it's what I didn't see afterward. Whatever that thing was, it lived somewhere out in that back pasture, in those trees, moving in ways I couldn't track and leaving drag marks instead of prints. And the worst part is that the land was big, too big to ever fully search, too thick and overgrown to see more than a few feet ahead. Somewhere out there, something was living on that farm that shouldn't have been there, something real and breathing and wrong in a way my brain still tries to forget. And even now, years later, I still remember the way it looked at me from across that creek bed, calm and curious, like it knew something I didn't. And I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't backed away when I did. I spent most of my early 20s working on a farm in the middle of nowhere, a place where the next neighbor was a half-mile down a dirt road and the fields stretched so far they blended into the sky. People think farms are all fresh air and peaceful sunsets, but what they don't understand is how quiet it gets. Sometimes too quiet. When the wind dies and the insects stop and the world around you feels like it's turning its head to stare at you, that's when the land feels wrong. The story still bothers me whenever I think about those empty fields. It was late summer, the kind of week where the heat sits heavy on your skin and makes every step feel slower. I had been doing evening checks on the far side of the property. That section of land had an old barn my boss never used anymore. The wood was turning gray, boards warped, rust creeping over the hinges. It wasn't haunted or anything stupid like that. It was just a piece of forgotten farm equipment left to rot. Still, walking near it always gave me a weird feeling. Not fear exactly, just a sense that the place had been abandoned for a reason. Every day I checked the fence line that ran behind the barn. The wire had been sagging lately, and we'd been losing chickens to something slipping in at night. Probably foxes or stray dogs. Nothing dramatic, but I needed to make sure the fence stayed upright until we could install new posts. The first strange thing I noticed was the dust pattern behind the barn. Normally the ground there stayed dry, hard, and untouched. But that evening, when the sun was dropping low and casting long shadows across everything, I saw drag marks through the dust. Long, uneven streaks that curved back toward the tree line. They weren't clean grazing paths like cattle would make, and they didn't look like footprints from dogs. They were more like something heavy had been pulled or had slid across the ground, cutting a wide path through the layer of dirt. I crouched down and brushed my hand over one of the streaks. It was deeper in some parts, lighter in others, zigzagging in a strange pattern. It made no sense. Dragging a heavy object would leave straight lines, but this looked like something had moved on its own, scraping as it went. I stood up and looked around. Nothing was there, just tall grass and heat waves rising off the ground. I finished my checks and walked back before it got dark, but the image of those marks stuck with me the rest of the night. I kept replaying them in my head. The curves, the depth, the odd pauses in the streaks, as if whatever made them had stopped, shifted weight, then continued dragging forward. The next evening, when I went back out, the marks were fresh again. Not just older ones I hadn't noticed, new ones. More of them. They cut across the same area, overlapping in places like something had been pacing along the back of the barn. I felt uncomfortable bending down to look again, like the air around me was too still. My skin prickled even though the heat hadn't faded yet. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The land was usually full of noise at that time. Crickets, wind, the low rumble of cows in the distance. But behind that barn it felt like everything had taken one step back, leaving me alone there with something I couldn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those marks came at night, not during the day. A couple days later, my boss told me he'd heard strange noises near the chicken coop the night before. Just faint scratches, but enough to make him think something bigger than a fox was poking around. He asked me to do rounds a bit later in the evening, just to catch anything slipping through. I agreed, even though some part of me twisted in my stomach at the thought of being out there after sunset. That evening, clouds waited low on the horizon, but the sky stayed clear long enough for the last bit of sunlight to fade slow and heavy across the fields. I walked toward the old barn with a flashlight in my hand, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to attract attention. I moved slower than usual, listening for any odd sounds. The air felt thick, like something was pressing against my ears. When I reached the back of the barn, the ground looked worse than before. Dozens of drag marks now, overlapping in every direction. Some cut deep grooves into the dirt. Others were thin and sharp like something with weight but no real grip had slid fast across the ground. The grass nearby was flattened unevenly, not like an animal bedding down but like something large had pushed through without lifting itself. My chest tightened hard. Everything in me said to leave, but I forced myself to stand there a moment longer. I wanted to understand what I was looking at. I crouched again, running my hand over the grooves. They were still warm from the day's heat, but something about them felt unsettling, like the earth had only recently stopped shifting. I stood up fast when I heard a faint, slow scrape from inside the barn. I didn't want to turn around, but instinct made me. The barn stood silent, the doorway dark. A thin breeze moved through the grass, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like something changing pressure around me. I held my breath without meaning to. The scrape came again. Not loud, not sharp, just a slow dragging inside the building. Every sense in my body told me to leave. I backed away step by step, making sure not to look away from the barn. I didn't want to give it my back. The sun was almost gone now, the sky turning into that deep blue that always made the farmland feel endless. I kept walking backward until the barn was far enough away that I could turn and start moving quickly across the field. When I reached the clearing near the house, all the normal sounds returned. Crickets, wind, night birds. My breathing finally loosened a little, but the tight feeling in my chest didn't fade. For the next few days, nothing happened. I avoided the old barn as much as I could, doing only the bare minimum around it. Each time I got near that area, the drag marks were fresher, like something was coming back every night and circling around. Sometimes the grooves led straight to the barn door before turning away again. Sometimes they formed wide loops around the fence posts, and sometimes they stopped abruptly, like the thing had lifted off the ground or settled somewhere out of sight. It got to a point where I didn't like walking past that part of the property at all. Even during the day, the air back there felt wrong. Too stale, too heavy. Like the temperature dropped a few degrees whenever I stepped near the barn. One night, everything finally made sense. At least enough for me to know I needed to leave. I was walking back from checking the water troughs. The sky was starless, heavy with clouds that looked like they were trying to swallow the moonlight. I didn't hear anything at first, just my boots crunching gravel. But when I passed within sight of the old barn, I noticed something that made my entire body go cold. The barn door, usually half-warped and stuck slightly open, was pulled wider than normal. A few inches more maybe, but enough for me to notice. Enough for my stomach to clench hard. I knew it had been partly shut earlier. I stood still, staring at that door. The grass in front of it was flattened, pushed outward in a wide arc. The dirt had long sweep marks across it. Something had come out recently. The silence surrounding the barn was the thickest I had ever felt in my life. No animals, no bugs, just empty, suffocating stillness. I forced myself to stand there a bit longer because something in me needed proof I wasn't imagining everything. Then I saw it, just a small thing, but enough. A fresh drag line trailed away from the barn, cutting through the grass in a long, uneven path. It wasn't old. The edges were still sharp. The dust along the deeper grooves hadn't even settled. It wasn't heading toward the fields this time. It was heading toward the house. Not directly, not in a straight line, but the path curved in the general direction I had come from, like whatever made it had been following behind me. I don't remember walking fast. I remember almost stumbling because my legs felt numb. Every step felt too loud. The night air felt too tight around my ribs. I didn't turn around because I didn't trust myself not to freeze if I saw anything move. When I reached the house, I shut the door behind me and finally let air rush back into my lungs. I didn't tell my boss anything, but I knew I wasn't going near that barn again. Not day or night. Whatever was out there wasn't something I needed to understand. 2 days later, my job there ended, and I left without looking back at that part of the property. As the truck pulled away, I could still picture the drag marks across the dirt. The looping patterns, the smooth curves, the deep grooves leading toward the barn door. I still don't know what moved around that building. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't some legend. It was something real, something heavy, something that didn't walk, something that moved the way nothing should. Something that paced behind that barn for days before following me across the field. I don't need to know what it was. I only need to know that I'm glad I walked away before it finally caught up. I grew up thinking farm work was predictable. Hard, dirty, repetitive, but predictable. You feed animals, fix fences, check gates, clean troughs, inspect feed, and walk the same stretches of land over and over until you know every inch of it. I thought nothing on that land could surprise me anymore. But one late autumn week proved to me how wrong I was. The air had started to cool enough to give the mornings a bite. Nights came earlier. The fields turned a tired yellow, the grass stiff and brittle under my boots. I was staying on my uncle's farm for a few weeks to help him catch up with chores before winter. He had a few dozen acres, not huge, but enough land that a person could be alone out there for hours without seeing anyone else. The strange part started with something small, just a weird pattern I found one morning in the lower pasture. The pasture sat behind a line of cottonwoods with branches that hung low and rattled in the wind. I had walked that path so many times I could have done it blindfolded. But that morning I noticed patches of grass pressed flat in a way that didn't sit right. Not circular, not neat, nothing like deer bedding down. Just long, dragging streaks, as if something heavy had slid across the ground. The dirt underneath was scraped thin and uneven. I crouched down and ran my hand along the disturbed earth. It looked like someone had pulled a large piece of equipment through the field, but there were no tire tracks, no prints, no signs of hooves, just streaks that stretched across the grass in long paths that didn't match any animal movement I knew. I shrugged it off and finished the chores, but the image stuck in the back of my mind for the rest of the day. The following morning, I found more of the same marks, except this time they crossed my earlier footprints. Something had moved through the pasture again during the night. It made me uneasy in a way I didn't want to admit. Animals leave patterns, even sick animals, even injured ones. There's always a rhythm to how they travel. These streaks had no rhythm, no breaks, just long dragging lines across the land as if something had slipped over the ground rather than walked on it. By the third day, the marks had doubled. Some of them ran right up to the fence line, stopping inches before the wire. Others crossed near the creek bed, where the mud was soft. In the mud, I expected at least one clear track, but I found nothing. Not a print, not a claw, not a hoof mark, just smooth, dragged-out impressions. I felt a tightness in my stomach every time I went out there. I didn't talk to my uncle about it. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a fallen branch had been pushed by the wind. Maybe some old irrigation pipe had shifted. But none of those excuses sat right with me. One evening, I stayed out later than I meant to. I had lost track of time fixing a broken latch on the large feed gate. By the time I finished, the sun had already dipped behind the hills. The sky held that deep blue color right before darkness pulls everything down with it. I had to cross the lower pasture to get back to the house. I had walked that stretch 1,000 times, but that night the air felt different. Still, almost hollow, like the land was holding its breath. The moon hadn't risen yet. The field looked darker than usual. My boots pressed through the cold grass with soft crunches, and my breath came out in short, foggy bursts. I kept glancing at the ground without even meaning to, looking for the streaks. With every few steps, I could feel my shoulders knotting tighter. About halfway across the field, I heard something. Not a loud sound, not even a clear one, more like the faintest scraping, as if something rough dragged lightly across dry grass. Came from behind me, maybe 50 yards back near the cottonwoods. I stopped walking. My entire body went tight. The cold air stung my throat. I stared toward the trees, but the darkness swallowed everything. The sound came again, soft, slow, dragging. Couldn't place it. It wasn't the wind. The wind had died completely. It wasn't an animal stepping. It was too smooth, too steady. My chest tightened. I felt a strong, instinctive urge to start moving again, but my legs didn't listen at first. I stood there longer than I should have, staring into a wall of black where the pasture met the trees. There was no shape, no movement I could actually see, but something in that darkness felt like it was focused on me. I forced myself to walk, not quickly at first, just steady. Every few steps I looked back. Every time I did, the sound stopped. When I faced forward again, it returned, slow, dragging on dry grass. I sped up, feeling the first signs of panic rise in my chest. My boots hit the ground too hard, my breaths coming out too fast. The house lights were still far away across the open field, but I locked my eyes on them like they were the only safe thing left. The sound behind me grew louder, not by much, but enough to know it was closer than before. The dragging had a weight to it, something heavy sliding in uneven intervals, as if the ground was being pulled apart in small sections. I didn't run. Running felt like it would make everything worse, but I walked fast enough that my steps sounded frantic. When I reached the top half of the pasture, where the land slopes upward, I risked turning around. There was nothing there, just the empty field blending into darkness. But the streaks were visible even in the low light, fresh ones, long and dark, cutting across the grass in smooth sweeping arcs. They hadn't been there earlier. The scraping stopped completely the moment I faced it. That silence hit harder than the sound. I felt completely exposed on that slope, standing in the open with nothing to hide behind. My skin felt cold in a way the air couldn't explain. I backed up slowly before turning and walking toward the house again. My legs felt numb. My hands shook. I didn't look behind me anymore. I didn't want to hear anything else. I didn't want to know how close it had gotten. When I reached the gravel near the house, the night sounds slowly returned. The insects, the distant rustle of wind, the normal noises that had been absent in the field. It was like stepping out of a sealed room back into the world. I barely slept that night. Every time I shut my eyes, I pictured those dragging lines across the pasture. Crisscrossing like something blind was feeling its way through the land. The next morning, I forced myself to check the field. I needed to know if I had imagined the sound, if fear had twisted something ordinary into something worse. But when I reached the lower pasture, I froze. The streaks from the night before were there, clear, deep, and unmistakable. They formed long, winding paths through the grass. Some cut straight lines across the field. Others looped around, crossing themselves like whatever made them had changed direction without lifting off the ground. They all led back to the cottonwoods, vanishing into the shaded area beneath the branches. The worst part wasn't the number of streaks. It was how close some of them came to where I had been walking. One of them passed no more than 6 feet from the trail I had taken home. I stood there staring at it, realizing how near I had been to something I still couldn't picture. I followed the streaks only a few feet toward the tree-line before I stopped. The ground felt colder there, like the shade carried more weight than normal. Something about that area felt wrong in a way that sank into my stomach. I didn't need to get closer. I didn't want to. For the rest of my stay, I avoided that pasture whenever I could. I stayed near the barns, near the equipment sheds, near places with solid ground and noise and light. The lower field stayed quiet during the day, untouched except for the marks that never fully faded. At night, I could sometimes hear faint scraping sounds from far off, carried lightly on the wind, but I never went out there again to check. When my time helping my uncle ended and I packed up to leave, I walked one last time along the fence line, staying far away from the cottonwoods. The streaks had scattered again in new places, thin but visible, as if something had been passing through during the night. I stared at them for a long time and realized I didn't care what had made them. I just cared that I never wanted to meet it again. Nothing supernatural happened. Nothing impossible. Something real had moved through that pasture. Something heavy, something silent, something that didn't walk the way anything should. And it got close to me, closer than I ever want to be to something I can't understand. Even now, years later, when I see long grass flattened in strange shapes or hear soft dragging sounds in fields, my chest tightens the same way. I still picture those lines crossing my path that night, only a few steps away in the dark. The land doesn't always give answers. Sometimes it just gives warnings. And that night in the lower pasture was the clearest warning I have ever had in my life. I spent a few years working on a ranch in Texas that felt like its own world. 20,000 acres of land is hard to even picture until you're standing in the middle of it, with nothing but open fields, mesquite trees, long stretches of fences, and miles of rough dirt roads that seem to go on forever. When you work in a place that big, you get used to feeling small. You also get used to seeing things that don't show up anywhere near a normal town. The ranch had problems like any other ranch. Broken gates, downed fence lines, busted water troughs. But the one thing that never seemed to slow down was the stray dog problem. Word traveled around between hired hands that the strays had been breeding with coyotes for years, creating animals that didn't look quite right. Some looked mostly like dogs, some mostly like coyotes, and some were the strangest mixes I'd ever seen, like the pieces of the animal didn't match the rest of it. I had heard stories before I ever saw one for myself. Things like massive dog heads on bodies that were too thin, or legs that looked too long for how wide the chest was, or tails that didn't match the rest of the body at all. When you have that much land and that many wild corners where no one goes for weeks, strange things can hide and grow without anyone noticing. But hearing about them and actually seeing them are two very different things. For the first few months, I was mostly handling fencing and water lines, riding around in an old ranch truck that rattled so much it felt like the bolts were loose. I spent long days under the sun, sweating through my shirt by 9 in the morning, drinking warm water out of plastic bottles, and listening to the steady hum of insects. It was the kind of job that wiped you out but made you feel like you were actually doing something that mattered. Nothing creepy happened during those early months. The land was big, but it felt predictable. That changed during one long stretch of work when I had to check a far-off pasture that almost never needed attention. It sat near the edge of the ranch property, near some rough terrain with thick brush and shallow dips in the land that made it feel more wild than the rest of the place. I had put it off for a few days because the area was out of the way and the road leading to it was rough enough to make the truck bounce so hard the steering wheel had to be held with both hands. But eventually I had no choice but to make the drive. The day was hot in a dull, steady way that made everything feel heavy. The sky was a flat blue, and the air shimmered over the dry dirt. When I reached the pasture, I parked the truck, stepped out, and listened to the quiet. There was no wind, no cattle nearby, not even birds. The whole place felt strangely still. I walked the fence line, checking the wire, testing the posts, and kicking at the dirt to see if anything had been digging around the base. It all looked fine, which was good, but it meant I was stuck walking the full perimeter in the heat. About halfway around, I reached a small dip in the land where a dry creek bed cut across the field. I climbed down into it to check the fence where it crossed. The shade felt good for a second, cool against the sweat on my face. But as soon as I stepped deeper into the creek bed, the smell hit me. It was sharp and sour, like something dead had been sitting in the heat for days. I slowed down, scanning the brush for the source. There, caught against the wire of the fence, was the body of a stray dog, or at least something close to a dog. It was half decayed, skin pulled tight over bones, patches of fur still clinging to a few spots. But the head was huge compared to the body, almost swollen looking, with a jaw that looked too long and too heavy. The legs were thin and oddly shaped, like they belonged to something lighter. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. Nothing about it looked right. At first I thought maybe the head had bloated from the heat, but even then it didn't explain the proportions. The ribcage was narrow, almost coyote-like, and the tail was bushy in a way that didn't match the thin legs. The more I looked at it, the more the pieces didn't fit together. I backed out of the creek bed and made a mental note to come back later with gloves and a shovel to get rid of the body. But the feeling I had while climbing out didn't leave. It felt like the land was holding its breath. The rest of the day went normally. I finished the inspection, loaded back into the truck, and drove toward the center of the ranch. I tried to shake off the strange feeling by focusing on work, telling myself I had just seen a weird mix of breeds. That kind of thing happened. But the next morning, something else happened that made the whole situation feel much heavier. I was driving out before sunrise, heading to check some water lines. The horizon was just starting to glow orange, and the air was still cool. As I drove along a long straight stretch of dirt road, my headlights picked up movement near a grouping of mesquite trees. It was quick, just a flicker at first, but then something stepped out onto the road ahead of me. I slowed down, thinking it was a coyote, but when it walked into the full beam of the headlights, I realized it was something different. Its head was massive, far bigger than it should have been for how narrow the shoulders were. The neck looked strained under the weight of the skull. The body looked coyote-like but stretched, with thin legs that bent at angles that didn't look right when it moved. The tail was long and bushy but held low, dragging almost in the dust. The animal didn't run. It just slowly crossed the road, each step uneven, like it was struggling to balance its own weight. Its ribs stuck out sharply, its skin pulled tight over bones. I don't know if it was sick, starved, or just born wrong from generations of stray dog and coyote mixing, but it looked like something nature hadn't meant to make. I felt a cold wave of discomfort crawl across my skin as I watched it limp toward the brush on the other side of the road. In that moment, I realized just how wild and unmonitored parts of the ranch truly were. Something like that could live out here for years without being seen more than once or twice. The land was big enough to hide entire groups of animals that didn't look quite normal anymore. And it wasn't anything supernatural or unnatural. It was simply the result of isolation, stray populations, and genetics mixing in ways they weren't meant to. The animal disappeared into the brush slowly, almost painfully, and the silence that followed felt strange, too calm. I sat in the truck for a long moment, watching the spot where it vanished, feeling that same quiet pressure I had felt in the creek bed the day before. The sense that something wasn't quite right on that side of the ranch. Over the next few weeks, I saw more signs that something was off. Tracks that were too big for a regular dog but the wrong shape for a coyote. Bones scattered around old fence lines. Tufts of fur caught on barbed wire that were colors I didn't recognize. Nothing dramatic enough to call anyone out there, but enough to keep me aware every time I stepped down from the truck. Once, while checking a water trough, I found large paw prints set so deep in the mud that I knew the animal must have been heavy. But the stride length was small and uneven, like the legs didn't match the weight. It was a strange combination that stuck with me long after I wiped the mud from my hands. Working in an area that big makes you understand how much happens outside the world most people know. Strange animals, strange tracks, strange shapes moving in the dark. You learn to accept them as part of the land. Not supernatural, not made up, just real life out beyond the places people usually look. The ending to all of it came for me one evening when I went back to that far pasture for the last time before quitting the job. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the fields gold. I parked the truck and walked the fence slowly, listening to the low hum of insects and feeling the heat of the day still trapped in the dirt. When I reached the creek bed again, I looked down at the spot where the strange, bloated-headed dog had been caught. The body was gone, cleaned out by scavengers, dragged off, or washed away by the occasional rain. But the fence still had something caught on it. A strip of skin, dry and paper-thin, stretched out like something had scraped against the wire hard enough to leave a piece behind. Seeing that small, simple piece of skin made everything feel real in a way nothing else had. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't rumor. Something was out there, living in the quiet parts of the ranch, shaped by isolation and rough conditions and the strange mixing of genetics. Something real but wrong in a way that stayed with you. And that is what settled things for me. The world doesn't need anything supernatural to be frightening. Out in places that big, nature creates its own strange forms, its own mistakes, its own creatures that don't fit into any clean category. The fear comes not from the idea that they're impossible, but from the realization that they're real, and that they're out there, slipping through the brush, crossing empty roads before dawn, dragging themselves along fence lines in the dark. The ending, for me, was understanding that the scariest things on that ranch weren't ghosts or legends. They were living animals, shaped in ways no one expected, surviving in the open spaces where no one ever looked closely enough. And the clearest truth of all was simple. On land that huge, you don't always know what's out there. You just learn to keep your eyes open and accept that some things will never fit neatly into the world you thought you understood. I grew up on farmland, so late nights, long drives home, and unexpected chores were normal parts of life. None of it bothered me much. I was used to being out in the fields after dark, feeling the cold air moving over the dirt rows, listening to the quiet that always came after the sun went down. But there are a few nights from those years that still sit heavy in my memory, and one of them happened on a night when all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sleep. I had been out of town for most of the day, driving back roads and dealing with errands that took way longer than I expected. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led toward our farm, it was late enough that the fields around me had that deep, empty look that always comes before midnight. The sky was clear, but the moon was thin, and everything had this dull blue tone that made the rows look endless. I could feel the tiredness in my shoulders and the stiffness in my legs from being in the truck so long. I just wanted to get home. I was only a few minutes away when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was my dad asking if I could stop and shut off some irrigation valves before heading in. We were running a bunch of rows that week, about 20 or 30 at a time, and if someone didn't shut the valves off at night, we'd end up wasting water or flooding spots we didn't want to flood. It wasn't a big job, just something we all took turns doing. Normally I'd grab a flashlight out of the back seat, but I didn't bring one that day. I figured the headlights on the truck would be enough, and since the valves were in a straight line, all I had to do was pull up, leave the engine running, and walk row by row. I drove up along the field edge and positioned the pickup so the headlights stretched down the first set of rows. The beams cut through the dust and lit up the dry soil, making the valves shine a little. I left the truck idling, stepped out, and started moving down the line, shutting valves one by one. The handles were cold and a little wet from the water pressure, and the faint smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp smell of the truck's exhaust drifting across the rows. The field was so quiet it almost felt insulated. No wind, no insects, nothing except the sound of the idling engine and the crunch of my boots. I kept my eyes mostly on the valves in front of me, counting them automatically in my head. I remember thinking how nice it was going to feel to get inside and collapse into bed. I was about halfway down when everything suddenly dimmed. Not a flicker, not a quick blink. It was like something solid passed through the headlights and blocked them. The right side went dark first. My whole chest tightened. I turned fast enough that I almost lost my footing on the loose dirt, and for a split second I saw something tall enough to completely cover the passenger side headlight. It didn't pause. It didn't make a sound. As soon as I noticed the shape, it moved across the beams and blocked the driver's side light too, passing in front of the hood of the truck like a shadow moving across a wall. It didn't look like a person. It didn't look like any animal I could name either. I only caught the outline, tall, solid, fast. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but it was enough for my stomach to twist and for the hair on the back of my neck to stand up in a way I had never felt before. I stood there with my hand still on the wet valve handle, staring at the dark space where it had passed. The lights were normal again, shining right down the rows like nothing happened. The truck engine sounded the same. The field looked the same. Everything was the same except the pounding in my chest. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything at all. The silence felt heavier than before, like the whole field was holding its breath. I tried to talk myself into believing it was just a big coyote or a stray farm dog or even a deer running across, but the shape I saw was too tall and the movement too smooth. I wanted to finish the valves, but the thought of turning my back to that darkness made my skin crawl. Still, I forced myself to do the rest, moving faster than before, counting each valve with tight, shaky breaths until I finally reached the last one. I didn't look around again. I walked back toward the truck with my shoulders stiff and my hands cold and climbed inside so quickly I barely registered the door closing behind me. I didn't calm down until I was halfway home. Even then, the feeling of something tall and silent moving through the light stuck with me in a way I couldn't shake. But that wasn't the only unsettling moment I had on the farm. The thing that stayed with me even more happened months later, in full daylight, when there should have been nothing creepy at all about being outside. We were planting trees along the river with a tractor and an old truck we used for hauling tools. The river was low that day, and the sun was bright enough that the water had that metallic shine to it. I remember being tired and sunburned, but it was normal farm work, nothing special. We had planted so many rows already that my hands were sore from lifting trees and packing soil around them. At one point I heard splashing from the river. At first I didn't pay much attention because there were always animals out there. Raccoons, strays, sometimes coyotes, but the splashing didn't sound like normal animals moving. It was chaotic and sharp, like something struggling. When I looked up, I saw a group of stray dogs crowded around something in the water, their bodies jerking and lunging. My first fear was that one of our dogs had gotten down near the bank and was being attacked. We had already lost a couple of dogs to stray packs, and each time it turned into a huge mess at home. I moved fast. I hit the side of the truck to make noise, trying to scare them, and the metal rang loud in the open air. I kept banging and grabbed a rock from the ground, throwing it as hard as I could. It landed close enough that the dogs finally scattered, running up the bank and disappearing behind brush. When the water calmed enough, I saw the animal they had been attacking. It struggled toward the edge, dragging itself out with slow, uneven movements. It climbed onto the bank opposite me, about 10 feet away. At first I froze because my mind was trying to fit it into something familiar, a sick dog maybe, or one with mange. But the shape wasn't right. It was hairless, completely bare-skinned in a way that made its body look raw and unnatural. The skin was grayish, tight over thin limbs that looked too long for its body. Its legs almost reminded me of a deer's legs, spindly and jointed in a strange way, but the body was shaped more like a dog's. When it lifted its head, I saw a long, rectangular snout, too blocky to look normal, and its ears stood straight up like it was alert, but they were a little too big, sticking out at angles that made the whole head look off balance. Water dripped off it as it staggered forward and then slipped partly into a bush, pausing to look back in my direction. Its eyes didn't look aggressive. They looked exhausted, almost dazed. But the way it stared made my stomach twist in the same way it did that night in the field. Like I was seeing something that shouldn't exist in that shape, something my brain was trying but failing to categorize. The animal stumbled deeper into the brush and disappeared. I didn't chase it. I backed toward the truck, my heart beating hard, and climbed in, still trying to understand what I had seen. The more I replayed it in my head, the more wrong the proportions felt. Every normal explanation I tried to give myself fell apart. A mangy dog didn't move like that. A deer didn't have a head like that. And nothing I knew had that combination of features. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about it. I tried to convince myself it was just a sick animal, something so thin and hairless that its natural shape looked distorted. But even telling myself that never fully settled the feeling. I've spent my whole life around animals. Healthy ones, sick ones, wild ones, strays, and I've never seen anything else like that. And part of me knows I probably never will again. But the memory of it, paired with that silent shape crossing in front of the headlights months before, left a mark on me. Not because I think it was something impossible, but because it reminded me that the world is full of things that don't fit neatly into categories, things that move through the dark or pull themselves out of a river in daylight, things you can't explain even when you replay them 100 times. The ending, for me, is simple. I still don't know what I saw in either moment. I don't pretend to, but I learned that even on familiar land, in places you've walked your entire life, the most unsettling things can be completely real. Real enough to leave you standing in a field with your heart pounding, or staring across a riverbank at an animal your mind can't name. And that kind of fear, the kind tied to something real and alive, stays with you far longer than anything supernatural ever could.